fantastic. So yeah, I'll just do a little quick introduction and then I'll hand over to you, Simon.
Great.
So there we are recording now. So hi everybody. Yeah, welcome to this session, which is part of our outduction week, we're calling it, which is the sort of transition from being a student to the world of work or the world of whatever you want to do after you finish studying. Just so you know, we are recording this session, so don't feel you need to take millions of notes, because you will be able to watch it back afterwards, and there will also be a transcript available. And yeah, so my name is Lucy Palmer. I work in the Career Centre, and I'm joined by my colleague Abhinav, who's one of our fantastic peer support assistants, and he's going to be keeping an eye on the chat for any questions you have. So if anything comes up that you want clarification on, or if you think of a question you want to ask, please do just put it in the chat as we go along, and we will have a kind of chat at the end of Simon's presentation. So as well as this session, we've also got loads of stuff happening this week to do with becoming a Leeds graduate. So straight after this, we've got a session about, are there any graduate jobs post-pandemic, which I think will be very interesting, delivered by a guy from Prospects, who are like the graduate people. They know everything there is to know about graduate employment. And as you can see, for the rest of the week, there's loads of stuff going on as well, mostly virtual, but with a couple in person as well. And I'm going to just put the link in the chat to my career so you can see everything else that's going on as well. And what else did I want to say? Oh yeah, and apart from all of these sessions online and in person, the Career Centre are going to have a stand in Union Square in LU this week from 10 till 4. So if you want to pop along, or if you happen to be in the Union, pop downstairs, come and see us, and we can answer any questions that you've got and provide tips and advice and support for all your questions about graduate employment. So without further ado, I'm going to go to the next slide and pass over to Simon, our speaker for today, and let him introduce himself and go for it.
Thank you very much, Lucy. So, hello everybody. My name is Simon Morris. I am the Assistant Head of Student Support with responsibility for disability services here at the University of Leeds. I just wanted to give you a bit of an introduction to me and why I'm here talking to you. So, as part of my role, I'm Head of Disability Services, and I've worked within education and disability for the past 18 years. I've also, in a previous life, I've just been explained to Lucy, quite an underqualified careers advisor. So I've also had sort of that experience of working with students on one-to-one in terms of making that next step and making plans for after study. Really, what my main experience comes from actually being a disabled person myself. So I'm registered blind and also have a diagnosis of dyslexia. And so really a lot of the presentation I'm providing you today is based on not only my sort of experience of working in education and working with students, but also coming from a personal perspective of being a disabled person within employment and trying to make that transition and making that next step. I'm also a serial job applicationist or job applier. I'm the kind of person that if I see something I fancy in terms of a new role, I'll apply. And one of the reasons I do that is because applying for roles and actually going through a recruitment process, especially as a disabled person, can be quite a challenge. And it's something that I've almost wanted to perfect the art of and work out what works and what doesn't, in what works for different types of employers and so on. So a lot of what I'm talking about is today is really based on my personal experience, and I think it's a bit of a caveat that I want to put in here, which is that a lot of this is based on my personal approaches and my personal views on support. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to match with you. So I'm very much a disability pragmatist. I believe in trying to work with people in terms of understanding the impact of my disability and how they can help me. I know that other people would be potentially maybe disability champions or campaigners and would very much strive for disability equality and rights, which I absolutely wholeheartedly believe in. My approach tends to be much more collaborative, however, and working on the basis of negotiation. So I want to just put that caveat in there, because that obviously is going to flavour some of what I'm going to talk about here and my general approaches. So It doesn't necessarily mean that if your approach is different that is wrong. I just want to put it in there because it just puts my slides and this content into some context. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So in this session, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a look at several different areas, and really that's sort of around reflecting on where you are now, the journey you've been on and what you've achieved. It's also about preparation for that next step. Things that you can do in order to prepare and how you can go forward, and then also making that transition itself. So, what's that actually like? What do you need to do? And the different approaches that you need to make, because there's a lot of decisions you're going to need to make in relation to making that next step. I also appreciate that in some of this, some of you will be going on to employment and some of you maybe further study. The focus of this for me and the way I've written these slides is very much about going into employment. But you could take a lot of what I'm talking about and actually apply it to further study if that is going to be your next step. Okay, then, have the next slide. So reflect and take stock. I think a massive part of this period, so coming to the end of a course, is about reflecting and taking stock on what you've achieved and the processes that you've been through. Undertaking a qualification, that's undergraduate, postgraduate, whatever it might have been, will have been a huge thing to do. You would have encountered a number of different challenges. You developed different strategies on how to manage those challenges, and that's probably been things that you've developed throughout your education. And this is probably the point where you're coming to the end of that particular journey. So I would really encourage you to reflect on the journey you've been on and actually give yourself some credit and celebrate some of the achievements that you've made. It's not often that we get time to feel proud, and regardless of what the actual final outcome of your course is, the actual final classification or grading, I think you just need to give yourself a bit of a pat on the back for the fact that you've got through it and you've done it. You've probably learned an awful lot about yourself. You've probably learned an awful lot about others and about how sort of the world works. And I just think it's a really good idea to actually reflect and take some time really to just think about all the things that you've achieved. I would also give some thought to about all the strategies that you've actually developed too. So actually how you've managed various different circumstances. So while you're feeling proud and while you've thinking about all the things that you've learned, actually think about what you actually did. How did you manage certain circumstances? And that'll become clear in a minute why I'm suggesting that you do that. I think it's really about actually having that thought process about different things that you've encountered, the way you've approached it, and how you've managed the impact of your particular disability. Because actually, managing a disability in itself is almost a full-time job. So you've not only completed a course which required lots of juggling and plate spinning, but you've also managed the impact of a disability, which, like I say, in itself can be quite a challenge. Okay, next slide. So I would say it's actually quite helpful, and I know that if I would have suggested this to me, at the stage you're potentially at, I probably would have ignored it. But I would suggest you actually create a physical skills audit. So an audit of all the things that you've learned, the strategies you've developed over time. It's amazing how quickly, when you get out of this environment and out of this scenario, how quickly you can lose or forget the skills that you've developed. So actually going through and thinking about the various things you've done in order to manage certain circumstances. So a classic one would be around, how you've managed time pressures. Time pressures are going to be a feature of your career moving forward. People are going to have different demands of you at different times. How have you managed that? What are the skills that you learned? Is it a case of keeping a diary? Is it a case of using your mobile, the calendar in your mobile phone? Is it something about writing a to-do list and actually having some way of checking that off and looking at progress? Whatever it might have been, actually create that kind of audit of the things that you've developed and you've learned. that also really helps when it comes to doing things like job applications, because disability aside, people are going to ask you questions around time management, prioritization, planning, so on and so forth. They're probably all things that you've actually been thinking about a lot because you've had to manage them more than others, and therefore you probably develop more strategy. So really give some thought to all the things that you've learned, how you've managed it and how you developed it, and actually make that physical skills audit. If you have got assistive technology, so if you've actually had assistive technology through disabled students allowances, or you use particular software in any way. Oh, can you still hear me?
Yep, yeah, we can hear you.
Sorry, my headset suddenly made a weird noise. So if the beauty of a recording, this so that me being a bit weird will just be there forever now. So if you've had assistive technology, especially if it's through disabled students allowances, that assistive technology probably still works. And if it doesn't, it's probably still under warranty. Get it looked at, get it fixed. They're the kinds of things that you will be able to use long term. So if you've got assistive technology through disabled students allowances, if it's under warranty, get it checked out, get it fixed before that warranty runs out, before you finish, because actually they are all pieces of kit that you can actually use, especially when you first start in your first roles, your first initial roles. And then lastly, I think it's about really celebrating your success. So I've said before about reflecting and being proud, but actually take some time to actually celebrate the fact that you've made an achievement, you've got to the end, you've progressed through, and that you've actually done and probably achieved an awful lot more than you probably thought you could, and at times probably thought you ever would. So I think it's really good time to actually sit and actually take some time to have success. And a bit of time out. So enjoy the time that you actually have now. Okay, next slide. So now it comes on to, you've done all your celebrating, you've reflected, you have felt proud, you have done your skills audit, you've thought about how you've managed all those different things. I think it's now time that what you need to do is be really starting to think about what the next step is going to be, and how you're going to use what you've learned to actually influence going forward. One of the main things I think is really important is, and this is especially before you actually leave the university, is collate together all the various bits of paper that actually that document all the support that you've had, all the diagnoses that you experience in terms of your disability, because they are all things that potentially the university has record of that you will need in the future. Once you've left university, all that documentation will go into archive, and over time will actually just be deleted and removed, and we won't keep copies of it. So you're going to need to create a bit of a library of all that kind of supporting information. So I've put on this slide here that there's a bit of a list there of the things you might want to collate. So that's things like your diagnostic evidence. If you've had a study needs assessment, get a copy of that. If you haven't got it, Disability Services, so my team will actually have that for you. And also, if you've done things like been on work placement, if you've done voluntary work, etc., as part of the university, or even just off your own back, if you've got anything that talks about that and about the things that you went out and achieved, then just make sure, again, you're just collating together copies and evidence of all that kind of information, because they're all things that you can actually draw on much later, but also they are things that you potentially are going to need later on too. So take some time and actually collate all that information together and put it in the same place where you put your skills audit, but just put it somewhere safe. Okay, next slide. So one of the things I think we need to really touch upon here is about disability support post education. So you probably would have noticed, if you've had disability support when you were at school, it was very different when you came to university, and it's even more different when you go into employment. When you go into employment, you do have access to funded support through Access to Work. But that funded support is probably more limited than it is within education, and is very much driven by you. It is you that needs to apply for that funding. It is you that needs to drive it forward. The assessments will happen with you. Your employer will have some involvement. Your employer also might be required to actually contribute towards the costing of some of the support that you might need. But I think it's really important for you to actually understand how access to work works. It's really easy to find that information. You can just Google it, go onto Google, type in access to work. Access to work has its own pages on the .gov website. You can find all the information there about how you apply, how you can find more information. I think it's important to note that you need to have at least a job offer to apply for access to work, because what they want to do is engage with you and your new employer to actually find out more about the actual job role. But I think you need to be prepared for the fact that you're probably unlikely to get the same level of support as you had at university in employment. So again, it's one of those things, just start having that bit of a think about what you might need, what were the things that really work for you at university, and what were the things that you absolutely would definitely need moving forward. But also about thinking about that new context. So education was one context, employment's going to be a completely different one. What you're going to be required to do is going to be different, so the support might need to be different. So just keep all that in mind and do your research. So the other thing I would say is that it's likely that when you go into employment that your colleagues and your employer may not have any understanding of you and your disability. And I would say in some circumstances, they may never have met a disabled person at all, or not knowingly anyway. I certainly found that going into employment and being visually impaired, it's pretty obvious that I'm visually impaired when I walk into a room, as I have a very large guide dog. But quite often that leads to huge assumption making on their part and quite a lot of panic. And I think that one of the skills I've absolutely learned is about giving reassurance to others about how to approach me and about the things that they can talk about with me and about disability in general. That is extra work that I do. And I understand that it's extra work that I'm putting in, and it's an administrative burden on me that other people don't have to do. What I have personally found is by putting in that bit of extra work and making people feel at ease and not minding too much if they get it wrong, especially if they're getting it wrong unintentionally, is that actually it just saves me time much later on, and I just get people up to speed much quicker and get them much more comfortable. That's especially important in things like interviews, because even if I've told somebody in advance that I have a disability, you'd be amazed how panicky non-disabled people can get in terms of how to help and support somebody with a disability. And that's not because they're actually trying to be discriminatory. It's because genuinely they don't know how to help. So I think it's very different if I think somebody is being discriminatory, or I think if somebody's being intentionally rude or discriminatory, then I would approach that differently. But I think genuinely, if it's somebody who's actually maybe just unsure or doesn't know and is making mistakes just because they are unsure or don't know, I work a little bit harder personally just to get them up to speed about my disability and about the things that I need, and about the kinds of support that I would or wouldn't want, because that just saves me a lot of time much later on. So I would really suggest that you think about how you might want to approach disability support within employment, and about how you might want to engage with colleagues. It is your choice, even if you disclose your disability, and we'll come on to disclosure in a minute. You may actually take the opinion that actually your disability is an invisible disability, and it's not something that you actually want to either discuss or have support for or engage with colleagues about. That is absolutely your choice. And in my circumstance, I kind of have to, because even with, times when I've tried to brazen it out and not use a mobility aid, it becomes very quickly obvious that I can't see very well if I'm falling up and down stairs and walking into walls, etc. So for me, it's not really a choice that I have, because I have to kind of I have to disclose, because it's quite important. but it is your choice. You know, for somebody, for example, if you have a diagnosis of dyslexia and you think, no, that's something that I feel comfortable in managing and I don't need support from anybody else, that's again something you might not want to discuss with colleagues, but I think it's just something you need to reflect on in terms of how you want to approach it. I would just say that if you are going to work with people and it's important for them to have a level of understanding, just think about how you might broach that conversation and about the things that you would or wouldn't want somebody to do in terms of support. Okay, next slide. So this comes back to disclosure. So disclosing a disability, whenever I have worked with anybody going into employment, disclosure is the biggest question anybody has. Should I or should I not disclose my disability, either on my application form or later on? There is no answer to this. It comes down to personal choice, and it also comes down to really experience. What I would say is I have always disclosed on my application form, and my thinking has always been that if I am discriminated at the point of application based on my application form, I don't want to work for them. That's my personal thinking. Now, it's very hard to prove whether you have or haven't been discriminated at the application stage, you know, unless it's really, really obvious. But I've always chosen to be upfront. I've also chosen very much to engage with a potential future employer about my disability. So not only do I put on the application form, do I tick the box. If there is no box to tick, I would actually contact the recruiting department or manager beforehand and just let them know. So if I've put an application form and I'm offered an interview, I would then contact them and say to them, there was nowhere on the form to say this, but I'm actually registered blind and I would require some adjustments for the interview. Can you tell me how the interview might run? What am I going to be required to do? And then I could talk to them about the kinds of support I would need. One of the things I very often need if I'm going for an interview is I can potentially get to the location of where the organisation is, but I may not be able to find the building or room. So I might ask is it possible to meet somebody? Could somebody meet me from a taxi? I think what I've always tried to do is make it as easy as possible. Again, so doing that little bit of extra work in terms of making it really easy for the organisation to help and support me. Because again, what I'm trying to do is demonstrate to the potential employer is that I'm just as capable as anybody else. I might need a bit more support, but I'm still just as capable in doing the job role. So what I try and do is just keep any support requests really, really practical, things that I know that they could potentially help with, and having just a really open and honest conversation. How you approach it is going to be entirely up to you. And I think it's going to be, again, coming back down to what I've talked about a little bit before about whether you feel that you either want support, that you need support, or you're going to need to disclose. I've always had a positive experience. I appreciate that not everybody has. So I think that my initial positive experiences led to me to always disclose. But again, that's going to be something which you're going to need to figure out and think about whether that's something you want to do. What I would say is certainly if you're going to need adjustments for the interview or you want your disability to be taken into consideration when you're actually employed, you're going to need to disclose at some point. So you know, if you want the organisation to make a reasonable adjustment, even if you've got through the interview stage and you're offered the role, if you're going to need them to make a reasonable adjustment to the role, you're going to need to disclose. You're going to need to talk to them about that. If you are disclosing at the point after interview, so once you've applied for the role, you may also get into some challenging times around whether the employer feels that you can actually meet the essential criteria of the role. And it might be that becomes a longer conversation about reasonable adjustments, because you're still going to need or be required to deliver and, you know, produce the same amount of work as anybody else, and actually, you know, achieve the outcomes of the role. There might be some adjustment that can be made, but yeah, I just think you're gonna need to have a think about the various stages, whether you disclose or not, and whether or not you want your disability to be taken into consideration. Okay, next slide. So this comes back to a little bit just what I've been talking about just a second ago. So I've obviously overrun on this particular slide, but again, this comes back to the practical steps. So if you want your disability taken into consideration, be asking and be clear about what support it is that you need. Don't assume anything. So don't assume somebody will have made anticipatory adjustments to an interview process. So if they don't know you're coming and they don't know you're disabled and they don't know you need reasonable adjustments, it's unlikely they will have made any. I personally would much rather go into an interview knowing that the reasonable adjustments I need have been made. So if nobody asks, you take the initiative and get in touch. Get in touch with the HR or the recruiting manager, let them know that you might need some reasonable adjustments. So don't assume anything. If you've ticked a box on an application form to say that you are disabled and you require reasonable adjustments and the interview date is coming and nobody has been in touch, get in touch with them. Again, don't assume that they will have just automatically known what to do and have it in place. It's much easier to ring somebody and then give you reassurance that it's all sorted than actually turn up on the day and find actually it's not sorted at all, because actually that just puts you on the back foot, and it just doesn't make for a great experience. Yeah, I think we covered the best of that. So can we go next slide? So making the transition to any new environment can be challenging, and I think this also comes back to the little bit of what I talked about right at the very beginning about reflection. I think it's about being really confident that you've done the preparation work, so you know the things that you excel at, where you have difficulties, and what strategies you use to manage those difficulties. So you've done that piece of work. You should feel confident that you know what you're doing. You've probably done all of the things that you're going to be asked to do in your new career a million times before. They're probably just not being called the same thing. So if you've been asked at work to write a report or write an assessment of, well, that's really just an essay. You've written loads of essays. So just use the same strategies that you've used before and use them again. Make sure you've got the support that you need. So again, this comes back to the not assuming. So if you do need some support and you have applied for access to work, make sure you're pushing that along. Access to work can take a phenomenally long time, and that's mainly because it is a government organisation. It's quite a small team. They are dealing with a number of students, and they'll want to actually do a number of assessments with you. Sorry. If you had a needs assessment while you were at university, let access to work know that. Let them know that you've already had an assessment for the types of support that you might need and that you would use in the future, because that probably gives them an idea that actually you probably have a really good handle on what it is that you need, and it means that they might actually be able to get some stuff in place for you fairly quickly. Even if they want you to have a more detailed assessment, there might be some interim support they can get in place for you. So do that bit of work. Just make sure you've got some support in place. Don't go in cold. Don't assume that when you get into work that actually it's all going to be there, it's all going to be sorted, and you're going to be ready for it. So yeah, this comes back to the other part of this. So you've been employed to do a job. You're going to be required to do that job. There might be reasonable adjustments for it, but I think it's just important to keep in mind that you're going to need to be able to deliver on the role that you've been asked to do. As a disabled person, you will have obviously asked for and looked and sought support for any reasonable adjustments that you need. An employer might not be able to make as many reasonable adjustments as you might want them to, because actually they'll be saying, well, no, this activity is actually, we need you to be able to do X, because that is actually an essential part of your role. You apply for the role knowing that you need to be able to do that. The expectation would be that you've thought about how you're going to manage that particular role. There might be some reasonable adjustments that can be made, but ultimately, if you need to be able to do a certain thing. So the example I'm going to give is that I had a student quite a long time ago who wanted to be a radiologist. In one of the activities they needed to do as part of being a radiologist was move a certain piece of equipment. They needed to move that piece of equipment on their own while they were actually with the patient, undertaking the related activity. to move the piece of equipment, they needed to lift their arms above their head. They couldn't actually do that. So the employer said, well, we need you to be able to move this piece of equipment. We can't supply somebody to come and do that as and when. You need to be able to do it. Long conversation later. Eventually a solution was found, but at a certain point, it was thought whether that person could actually continue in their job role, because they couldn't move that piece of equipment independently, and it wasn't possible to have somebody to go in with them. Now, eventually, the employer managed to find another piece of equipment, but that's just worth keeping in mind that there'll be activities that you are required to do, and because you have a disability doesn't mean that you automatically just it's fine, you don't have to do them. You will still have to actually produce and deliver. Never be afraid of critique. So certainly as a disabled person, what I would say is that in my first few roles as a dyslexic person and a visually impaired person, my typing is not always the best. I don't necessarily always get the spelling right, and then I don't always spot that I haven't got the spelling right. And I used to find it really, really challenging when people pulled me up on it, picked me out on it. Line managers would say to me, you really need to focus on this, and it just felt quite crushing. And it's because the difference being is when I was at university, I had time to spell check, I had time to get it proofread, etc., etc. When I was at work, I had to bash stuff out. I just got to get those emails out, get that report written, get it sent over, and it felt sort of like I was under the spotlight, and I took it quite a lot to heart. And actually, it wasn't until another colleague actually said to me, look, nobody's pointing this out because we don't think you can do the job. We're pointing it out because actually we know you can do the job, and actually you just need to work out how it is you're going to manage this going forward. And actually for me, the way I managed it going forward is that Access to Work pay for me to have a PA, and one of their roles is that if I'm going to bash out a report, I send my report over to my PA, who kind of spell checks it and makes sure the alignment is right and I haven't just got suddenly gone into a rogue color somewhere along the line. So there was actually a really good strategy that I could put in place, but initially when it was being pointed out, I used to get very defensive about it. I used to make me think, I was constantly thinking, oh, I'm going to get sacked. Nobody's going to, nobody thinks I can do the job. And it really did take that colleague just to say to me, no, we're pointing this out because we know you absolutely can do it. You just need to work out how you're going to manage this particular thing. So don't be afraid of critique. I think there's a difference between critique and criticism. But critique, welcome it, embrace it. If somebody's saying to you, you need to improve on something, then that's the point where you actually go back to that reflection exercise and maybe look at your skills audit and have a look at the kinds of things that you might have done before and how you might have managed those circumstances before. So actually have a think about those three. Okay, next slide. So in summary, really reflect on all the things you've learned and the journey you've been on. Really, honestly, do that skills audit, work out all the kinds of skills that you've learned and the things you've kind of developed over time. Make sure your kit and technology is all working, because even if it's old and you're probably going to replace it in the future anyway, doesn't matter. It just means that that initial, maybe that first job, maybe you go and do some voluntary work, you've got the kind of the kit that you need. If you have never had assistive technology, we've got some great pages on the Disability Services website where there's a list of free and low cost assistive technology that you can have a look at that might actually meet your needs. So have a look at some of those things. And I've got an assistive technology advisor here at the university who you can arrange an appointment with, who can have a chat with you about different techniques. So make sure you've kind of either what you've got is already working, and if you haven't got anything, then make sure you've had a look at and use the resources that are available to you. Gather together all those documents that relate to the support you've had before. Make sure you put all that in one place, maybe alongside that skills audit. So just save it somewhere so you've got copies, and then kind of really do that kind of preparation work. So alongside applying for jobs, work out the support that you might need, where you would get that support, i.e. access to work, And then also have that reflect on whether you would actually disclose your disability or not. And if you do, how you're going to manage that going forward. So how you're going to actually embrace that in a positive way. You can use the technique that I personally use, which is to do that a bit of initial groundwork with potential colleagues and employers to actually put them at ease and make them feel sort of more comfortable, just because actually long term I'm just doing a bit of disability training for them in advance, so maybe helping the disability cause just more generally, but if nothing else it just helps smooth the way for me. And then once you're actually in that employment, just remember you're going to be required to actually achieve the same as everybody else in that role. Make sure you're using all the support that's available to you. Make sure you're drawing on your colleagues in terms of, ideas about how you can improve and the things you can do. If you're getting critique, that's because actually people want you to kind of improve, they want you to succeed. They want you to help you sort of identify the areas that you're potentially a little bit weaker at. But that potentially means you can just go back and look at your skills audit. So all in all, for me, disability has never held me back in terms of my employment prospects. From my first job in, I'm going to say my first proper job, because I did an awful lot of voluntary work, but my first paid employment in 2004, I've been continuously employed. I have been successful in achieving multiple promotions across, moving between different organisations in different roles. I personally have found my disability has never held me back. I know that that is not the circumstance for everybody. What I would say is that don't let it be a barrier to you in terms of seeking employment or putting you off seeking employment. You will probably put in a significant number of application forms before you find the job role, your first one or your next one or whatever it might be. But don't be put off. Just keep persevering. You will find the role that suits you, and you will find an organisation where you fit. And you will also find that a lot of people want to be incredibly supportive. Initially, they probably just don't know how. And that's where I'm going to leave things. So I think the next slide is just any questions. So I would say what I hope to do in this session was really to give you a bit of a background and an overview. If anybody does have any questions, you can pop them in the chat and we can answer them. If not, I'm happy to wrap up here.
Yeah, and it's worth saying anything that you do write in the chat isn't then available after the session. So if you've got a kind of sensitive thing you want to ask about, your name then won't be tied to it for everyone to see forevermore. So yeah, feel free to do that. In the meantime, I do actually have a question, Simon.
Absolutely, yep.
Do graduates have access to your team after they finish for advice and support, or is it when they graduate?
No, when they graduate, there's potentially, because disability services, the role of disability services is to support students with identifying the support they need for while they're here. So actually the services we offer probably wouldn't be applicable to anybody going who's no longer a student. What I would say is that we do hold all students' records for 6 years after the point that they've actually left university. So if students haven't followed my very repeated guidance to collate together all your documentation, you can still come back to us and get that hold of those copies of documentation. It just will take us a while to do it, because we'll have to go through because your record will be archived. So there probably isn't a service that we would necessarily offer you as students or that you would find useful, but that doesn't mean that you just can't come and just sort of say, oh, have you got a copy of my dyslexia report or the medical letter that I submitted, because we will have that.
Fantastic. And it's probably worth just mentioning that obviously the Career Centre is available for after you graduate. So if you want to get your applications checked or do like a mock interview, you have to re-register as a graduate. But once you've done so, you have access to everything that you would have had as a student as well.
And also, just to, you mentioning that there, I think that the other part is that for graduates to realise and remember that, that services within the university do link up and talk to one another. So if you did go and see careers and you posed a question which careers were unsure about in terms of disability and employment, they'd probably reach out and come and have a chat with us anyway. So, we would still probably be providing some support, but probably through your careers team. So you know, that we do link up, we do share expertise. If we don't know an answer, we don't know a question, the answer to a question, we will actually reach out in the same way that if a student came to ask us about an employment criteria question, we would go to the careers team and say, who should we refer them to? What do you think? So we would try and do that.
Absolutely, 100%. I'm gonna stop recording because we've come to the end.